Okay.
Hello, today is August 30th, 2016. My name is William Winkle. This is the interview of Wayne Rudolph Davidson. This interview is for the Detroit Historical Society's Detroit 67 Oral History Project. Thank you so much for sitting down with me today, sir.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Can you please start by telling me where and when were you born?
I was born in Detroit, Michigan in 1951. I was born at Trumbull Hospital. Trumbull Hospital was located, and is still located, but not the building is still there, but the hospital is no longer operating off of Trumbull Avenue, and not too far from what we call now what was called Tiger Stadium, or what Tiger Stadium was on Michigan and Trumbull. The Jeffrey Projects was not too far, maybe a block or two over, or being created at the time that I was born. In 1951, that hospital was not a segregated hospital. It was blacks could come there and have their babies. Typically, before that time, I believe you had to there were a lot of midwives at that time. So my mother was a pretty industrious, pretty aware person. So that's probably why we ended up there at Trumbull Hospital. So,
what neighborhood did you grow up in Detroit?
I grew up in several neighborhoods. When I was a little kid, I can remember we lived on, not too far from here, this location, on Palmer and John R. area. And I can remember this would have been an apartment that my mother and father had by themselves, because when they came here, they had to live with relatives. And so I learned from my own research that that was the typical thing that somebody from the South would do. I probably need to bring that to your attention, that my parents were both, my father was from Kentucky and my mother was from Tennessee. And they met in Louisville, Kentucky, and then in the Negro migration, they moved up here following the jobs. And so my father got here, my mother and father got here in 1950, the 4th of July. That's what he'll tell you. He's still alive. He'll say, we got here on the 4th of July and we went straight to a barbecue on the bus. So, my mother was pregnant at the time, and so she's also athletic. And I think because of her athleticness, she lost the first baby. I would have been the second. But so I remember our home on John R., Palmer and John R. area, because as a little kid, I'd walk outside, or somebody would walk me outside, and I saw these cars, and I can remember these big, giant cars, these shapes. I guess I probably would have been about 2, 3, or 4, a little kid coming outside with the parents, and you looking around. So I remember that scene sort of vividly. Mm-hmm. And then subsequently, my brothers were born. Glenn was born in 52, and Bobby was born in 53. And so I believe at that time we moved from that area down to southwest Detroit, a place called on South Patricia Street. Right now, that house is still there. But at the time, I remember my brothers and I being in the yard, and we'd be playing, and there was a yard. We had a dog, some sort of dog. But the significant thing at that time was the freeway was being built. I-75 was being built. That house sits a butt to the freeway over in the Schaefer area. And I can remember hearing a lot of noise and hearing a lot of heavy work. And so that probably would have been about 54, 55, 56 time frame. So I think my father had bought the house, but I think somehow he may have lost the house, because I think at that time, blacks could not get loans from the banks. So what happened was he probably bought the house through what you call a contract.
A land contract.
Yeah, land contract, and probably didn't make the payment. So at some point lost the house, because I know that's always been you could always sense in my household that was a sore subject. between my mother and my father, and they sort of didn't talk about it a lot. If you ask questions about it, then you'd sort of be put off. So I believe after that, around 56, we moved from South Patricia to the Jeffrey Projects. Now, the Jeffrey Projects went up early in the mid-50s, part of urban renewal. And I don't remember what floor we stayed on, but it was one of those things that you knew that you got in the elevator, just like we got in the elevator to your office. And for little kids, it was a little exciting going up maybe 5 or 6 floors. I think the Jeffrey Projects were at least 12 floors, I believe. So that was pretty interesting living there, except for on occasions as the Jeffrey Projects got older, then the maintenance went down. So one of the warnings that we got as little kids was, be careful going into the elevator because the elevator may not be there. And I know at least that I can recall one occasion that some young kid pushed for the elevator and fell down. And fell down because the elevator was not there. So those three places were the most vivid, and the Southwest component always stuck out in my mind because even though my parents may have lost that house, my aunt lived not too far on Beatrice Street, and we would leave either our house in the south on Patricia Street or the Jeffrey Projects, and we would go there for Halloween and for special occasions. Because I can remember having barbecues and the families would be there, and they'd be talking. This was my mother's side, so they would be talking about the family down in Bolivar, Tennessee, and whether you were a Shirley or a Cheshire, because they had two different fathers. So that sort of would be part of the discussion. And we'd play baseball. We had a lot of room in Southwest Detroit, whereas compared to coming to the Jeffries, the room was, you were living more in a box. Matter of fact, this your office. Maybe if we tore down that wall a little bit, would really add up to being what the apartment size was in the Jeffries Projects. But on Patricia Street, we played. We were out in the yard, playing with the dog. We had, you had a lot of sunlight, and you had more room to run around. Whereas in the Jeffrey Projects, well, you had a lot of people living in a vertical unit, and you'd come down to get out of the. You didn't have. I don't recall having air conditioning, so in the summer you had to come down and sit. A lot of the mothers would be sitting with their children in those areas, and there were little small parks, but it was not as free, I would say, as having your own place and running around. So I remember those places vivid. Southwest Detroit, I remember because we went going to get Halloween candy. There was a lot of, you'd go and you'd get an abundance of Halloween candy, and that whole area was like, wow, we couldn't wait for Halloween,
The neighborhood you grew up in, were they integrated?
I know that I don't think that question was one of the issues at the time, but I think Southwest Detroit was integrated with Hispanic people. I don't recall that ever being an issue of. I know that we had to. My parents were always saying, "Well, we can't go here, can't go there," but I really can't define those neighborhood, the Southwest Detroit neighborhood, as being. I know that Hispanic people did grow up in those southwestern neighborhoods. Anglos, I can't recall.
Okay.
So
What did your mother and father do for a living?
my mother was a homemaker, and she also she was educated. My mother had she was trained. She went to school in Lane College in Tennessee, Jackson, Tennessee, and she was trained to be. At that time, they could only be homemakers. They would learn duties of taking care of other folks' homes, and she did not work every day. She worked periodically, so she spent most of her time being a mother and a homemaker. My father, he came from Barron County, Kentucky. He was a laborer. He did not have any education. He went up to education to the 4th grade. And in Barron County, Kentucky, Rocky Hill, Barron County, Kentucky, where he lived at, the next school was 13 miles up and 13 miles back. So he had no middle education. So he was always a laborer. When he got here, he was always pretty industrious. So he worked his way to Louisville, Kentucky, and he learned the skill of making mattresses. So he talks about this periodically. 1945 is when he left the farm to go to Louisville, and he got a job putting mattresses together. Excuse me. And he learned that trade, and then that took him. He got good at that trade. So when he came in 1950, excuse me, that's what the person who had trained him said. When you get up north to Detroit, then you can go here and get a job. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Can I get some water? Tell me about my dad. So 1945, he left the farm. He went to Louisville, and he was learning how to. He always was industrious, so he got a job doing various things. But the one job that he took with him, brought up with him to Detroit, was being able to put together, working for a mattress factory. So when he came in 1950, he was given an address and said, son, when you get off the bus, you can go over here and get a job. So he came July the 4th in 1950, and then the next day, which was a holiday, then on the 5th, or a short time later, he went to that address and he went to work. He said he walked past the place. He said, "Hey, I can do whatever you need," and he gave a point of contact. Next thing you know, he was working, and that place made whatever. I don't recall the name of the place, but they made nice, soft pillows and mattresses. And a couple of the pillows I remember distinctively because I carried them around for years, like a little kid, because they were so soft, feather pillows. So the wages were not very, very large, 5 cents an hour, 10 cents an hour, whatever. But around 1952, he went to, someone had told him that Briggs was hiring. Briggs was before Chrysler. Mm-hmm. So he went and stood in line, and at that time, when you got hired, because this was a labor deal, when you got hired, you'd stand there, and the foreman, just like you and I looking at each other, you would ask me the question, "Where you work last?" And so my dad said, "I worked at Jones Steel place." And then he said, "Oh, no, I can't use you." And so that's what the guy told my father. So he needs this job. So the next guy behind him was asked the same question. And so, but he was not black. So the guy said, "Well, I work at Ford." And so, okay, fill this paperwork out. And the gentleman went over. So my father, he didn't go home. He went and got in the back of the line. And when he came back up, the foreman asked him the same question. He asked him the question again, "Where'd you work last?" And this time my father said, "Ford." And then my father said, okay, wasn't you here before? He said, you cats are all alike. So he said, okay, you hired. And he gave my father the paperwork. And he started to work at Briggs. And then Briggs became part of Chrysler. And then my father worked there for the next 30 years to 1984, 83, 84. So he's been retired from there longer than he worked there. But that's how he got hired there. So he did work. But part of the challenge was being laid off. You know, at those time, the union, I don't know if you've ever worked for a union, but the union is a union town and they battle for certain things. My father was laid off a lot, and I remember when we were in the Jeffrey projects, they would be laid off. And so when you're laid off, it brings a lot of challenges because you don't have anything to do in a day. And so him and his buddy would, on the days they got their benefit, one would buy, if it's Tuesdays, Daddy would buy the beer and wine. If it's Thursdays, then his buddy would buy the beer and wine. And they'd get together and make what they call a concoction called a hobo cocktail. And that would get them through that week of, being unemployed. So that was not a good thing, because when you're sitting and you're unemployed, well, you ain't got nothing to do. Mm-hmm. So finally, Chrysler called him back to work in 1957. So, but the work was not here. It was in Twinsburg, Ohio. So he had for the next 2 years, he commuted from Detroit, where the Jeffrey Projects, where we lived at, to Twinsburg, Ohio, which is not far from Cleveland. That plant is now closed, but that's where he lived. That's where he commuted to and worked. And so subsequently in '59, that's where we moved for a period of time. So
how long did you stay in Cleveland?
We stayed in Cleveland from 1959 to 1965. So that was 8 years. So before I get to that, when I wanted to bring up that, now going back to the Jeffrey Projects, if you remember, rock and roll was going on at that time, or it was starting to be big. Well, when you're in a close quartered area, people are, need something to do. So most people would sit down in the evening, they'd be outside. Well, a lot of young people would be under the street lights and they would be singing creating doo-wop songs or whatever, because they, with the energy that young people have. And so some of the Motown folks grew up in that area, in the Jeffrey Projects and the Brewsters. So the same sort of scenario, because I was a lot younger. I would have been 6 or 7 or 8. I would have been 8, and so my mother, had to been close to my mother. You're running up and you see these guys doing whatever they're doing, and then my mother would say, "Wayne, Glenn, and Bobby coming back over here, whatever. They over there making noise," because mothers. That's what mothers think that kids do, make noise. So that was a pretty interesting phenomenon, seeing some of that as it grew up. I went to Poe Elementary School. Now, Poe Elementary School is the school that is still there today, because I think I went there for at least 2 years. And I remember we would come out and on like folks are getting ready for school now, and then the mothers would walk you to school and have a brand new whatever you got on. But I bring this up because that was spelled P-O-E. My father he grew up in Barron County in Kentucky, which is the area that the poorhouse is for the state of Kentucky. So you would hear that word all the time. If something was bad, he'd always be saying, "Well, I'm going to the poorhouse," And so when you go to when he's saying that, put a poorhouse at home, and then you go into Poe school, from a mental aspect, that's kind of bad. Now, another person who went to post school is Willie Horton. He used to play for the Tigers. I see him on occasion, and he grew up in the Jeffries. He's about 10 years older than me, so I probably saw him. I didn't know him at the time, and also Gates Brown was there, but I think Gates came later. But Willie, I probably saw him going to wherever he went with his baseball bat. So at that time, I was a little kid. Sitting with my mother and my brothers, and my mother controlling us and watching all these guys going to wherever they were going, the older guys. So as far as, I think that would have been that end of that time frame of being in Detroit, because I remember my father he felt that it was too much traveling to and from. So he came back from Cleveland one day and with a moving van, and he wanted to move us with him to Cleveland, and it would seem reasonable that would be okay. But most of my mother's family was here. They all grew up and gravitated here too. I have aunts and uncles who lived here, and my mother was a real family-oriented person. So it took him half the day to convince her So it took him half a day to convince her to move everybody to Cleveland. So, because it would have been easier. So, had some cousins who helped move, but my mother was real concerned about moving, even though she had relatives in Cleveland. But she had stepsisters in Cleveland, but her blood sisters were here. So that was part of the challenge. So we did move, and then we moved, and that's where we were at. So that was, but we'd come back each year, at least twice a year, and we had family and friends who lived in the Jeffries. So I still saw the Detroit scene, but I just didn't live every day here in the city of Detroit. So
on your trips back in the late 50s, early 60s, did you notice any growing tension in the city?
Well, I could say that I thought my family was also pretty sheltered, because my mother, I think my generation was a sheltered generation. When I say sheltered, meaning we were protected. And there was places, now, okay, you're talking about along Trumbull, in the larger houses, there were white families. So yes, that was an integrated neighborhood. But I never was engaged where somebody was tossing rocks at somebody, that sort of, or being hostile. Now, as far as being physical against anybody, I saw, I think, you had to be respectful for where you were at, but I didn't feel that the environment was really hot. Now, I can say later on I did, but during that time frame from 59 to 65, I don't think I could say that I felt that way. I just know that my mother was always a pretty protective person, and sort of protected us from a lot of the whatever was going on. We just weren't supposed to be in certain spots. So.
After you left Cleveland, did your family come back to Detroit?
Yeah. So we came here. We came back because my father got a job at Sterling Heights stamping plant. That opened up, and so when that opened up, then the idea was you didn't have to worry about my mother moving, or she was throwing stuff in the truck to get going. So, matter of fact, I had my 59 when we left. My mother had just had my young sister. She was born in 59, and so it wasn't that difficult she was ready to come back. When we came back, we moved on Blaine between 14th and 12th. Now, I can tell you, I thought all the other areas that we were lived in were real industrious people. And between 12th and 14th, it was a little more, hotter, or there was a lot of things going on. There was a lot of street smart people that lived in that area, put it that way. You sort of had to, I felt that I had to protect myself at all times. I went to Hutchins Junior High School, and that was on Woodrow Wilson. And so we had to walk home. Now, people were working, but you also felt that there was a lot of people who wanted to get things a little easier. Now, here's the thing about living in that area. This is now a Motown area, and I know this because in my own research, Motown is on Grand Boulevard. So within that one, and from it was 1 mile, 1.2 miles from my house on Blaine. So within that area, many of the Motown stars lived there. So on these houses, on these duplexes, you'd see guys with perms, with hair, and that's not. I didn't see that a lot when I was here before, as a little kid. So as I grew up, and I didn't. It was, you saw that in Cleveland, but I don't know. Cleveland folks were a little more. The area I lived in, it was a brand new project area, and it was a little. It was not. It was very nice. It was a brand new area, and it was. I couldn't say that people were hostile. When it moved to 12th and on Blaine and 12th, I felt everybody was trying to be Mr. Cool. You know, I remember walking one day from school, and this young guy had his he had on chains, and he had on a white beater shirt. And he was kind of muscular built, and he had a dog, a German Shepherd, and he had on a chain, and he was using the chain and whatever to control the dog, and it looked like he was looking for somebody. And it's like you didn't want him to be the person he was looking for. So that environment was maybe a little up tempo. Plus, there were many shops up and down, a lot of clubs up and down in that area. It's not just saying that it was non-industrious people. It's just that I was now looking through that. I was 14 at that time. So now things are looking different, you know. So I sort of had to protect myself a little bit more. And I remember some guys tried to jump on my brother as we came home from school. And these guys were pretty aggressive. So this was in 1965. We stayed over there for 6 months. We came back around right after school in 65, and we stayed as a 4 duplex. And then in 1966 we moved to where on Pinehurst in Grand River, 12682 Pinehurst. On the west side, and my parents owned that house for 40 years afterwards. So one of the things that when we were living on Blaine, my mother again kept us kind of close hold. We'd get up as a group and go to church in the car, family car. There was relatives who owned churches, and we would go there. We've always had like a happy home. My mother was a happy homemaker. She could cook, so you didn't mind being at the house because there was food there, and it was wonderfully made. It's very few times that we went without. So she could do a lot with a very little. So
Going into 67 now, were you still, you were living at Pinehurst and Grand River, you said?
yeah, we had moved. Yeah, so we moved from that area on Blaine and 12th, between 12th. Again, there are a lot of duplexes there, so multiple families. And matter of fact, going to Hutchins was the first time I even heard anybody really talk about sexual activity. There were two things, two conversations that I heard in school, because I'm growing up pretty naive. This girl was talking to this other guy about watching some family members in the house having sex, and there was a fight or a huge discussion on which group was the better group, the Four Tops or the Temptations. Okay, so that was going on for a 13, 14, 15-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in my house, the sex was not being discussed, so that's why I remember this vividly. Because on television, at that time, you saw relationships, romance, but they weren't getting all into what you'd see today, you know. So,
as a 17-year-old or a 16-year-old going into 67, did you anticipate or foresee any violence at summer in Detroit?
no. So here's the, I like my father, I was always working. When we moved over to Pinehurst, that was still an integrated neighborhood. Now, I remember the day we moved in, or we moved to the house, or saw the house. Our neighbors across, there was two senior citizens, white ladies, who saw us as we pulled in. And after that day, I didn't see them anymore. So I don't know if they moved or whatever, but our neighborhood was still integrated. But at that time, white flight was slow. It was not what you call really evident, because it was already going on earlier in the 50s. And then it's just that when we moved there, it was like, whoa, wow, man, you know, because we all had rooms, and it was a large wood frame house. I think it was built in 1922. The person who, 1926, I think it was. The person who sold the house to my parents had lived in the house for 40 years. Then my parents lived in it another 40 years, and it was well taken care of. So the neighborhood I lived in, I went to McKenzie High School. There, I'd go down, walk to Fullerton, walk down to Wyoming, take the Wyoming bus to McKenzie. The neighborhood was integrated. We could walk. Matter of fact, the Monkees was a big TV show at the time. Me and the guys that I knew, we'd be walking down the street singing their crazy songs or whatever. And it was sort of like being in Happy Days, per se. Jeffrey Freeways was not built yet. You know, there might have been some signs up, but it was not being built at that time. Because it sort of like happened all of a sudden. It's like when the riot happened, the freeway was being built, and the freeway divided what I'd call my portion of Pinehurst, and divided it to the freeway in the middle to the upper portion. And so now you got to cross over one of those bridges. Mm-hmm. And there's all of a sudden it's like it's changed, because man, you used to ride. I think a young lady named Emma Kidd used to live up the street from us, and a friend of mine that I knew from the Jeffrey Projects, he also moved up, because we would see people that we knew and we didn't know that they were there. And somebody said, "Hey, are you with Wayne Davidson?" "Yeah, I'm Wayne Davidson." "Well, I'm Willie Jackson. Remember me from the Jeffrey Project?" And so you'd sort of meet people that you knew before, because they were now no longer in the projects. I think one of my friends had Willie Jackson stayed in the projects till he moved on Mendota, which is the next street. Michael Hall, his family moved to Inkster, and then they were able to get a house. And so these houses were now available, and they were being people who didn't have houses before were able to get into. So there were white neighbors, and many there were a few mixed interracial folks, and everybody was keeping their grass cut and the places clean, because at the time people were working. My father worked all the time. People on my street worked, so there was no it was not a bad neighborhood. It was not a neighborhood like on 12th and Blaine that had a mixture of people not working and people doing shady stuff. So that was been '66, because I was delivering the Twin Pines Milk Company used to go up and down the street and bring people milk, and because our house had a milk chute. You could order milk and you put it in a milk chute. Well, I worked for that guy, so this is again before the riot. So I got up every morning, got on his truck, and I delivered milk to the folks. I had young legs, and he paid me whatever every morning. Then I also had a paper route. I had a lot of white customers, and I'd go up and I'd make sure their papers were properly on their porches, that sort of thing. So I was kind of industrious. I cut a lot of grass, and that's how I knew the neighborhood a little bit. I know there was a guy 2 stories down from me. He was a white gentleman. He was older. He had a little dog. I was cutting his grass every week, and he paid me or whatever. So yeah, the neighborhood was functioning, and it was integrated. So that would have been '66. It was nice and peaceful. Then I guess the freeway was starting to get built. I went to McKenzie, so I remember you could ride our bike. We'd ride our bikes all over. McKenzie is close to going out to the Fort Rouge plant. I don't know if you've ever seen well, when I was a kid, that was massive, and I worked there later, but I remember we rode our bikes over into Dearborn, and then there was a gentleman tried to run us over with his car. Now, at that time, Orville Hubbard was around, so you had to be careful because he was saying one thing, and so we didn't know we were in that area or whatever, because we were just riding our bikes. So I remember that distinctively. That was the only time I can think of where I was just walking down the street and somebody tried to do something to me or whatever. Mm-hmm. So you could be walking. A lot of times people did get into little scuffles, I guess you could say. I know a friend of mine, my brother and I went over to a friend's house, and then this other friend of ours met us over there. Well, when we came back, the police picked us up, and they said that there was a complaint. A little white kid was scratched up with some sharp object, and it wasn't me and my brother. So they took us all three with this my friend to the precinct, the 12th precinct on Schaefer and Grand River, and so we don't know what's going on, But it turned out that my friend, they took us because my friend had, the one who came later, he had a sharp object in his pocket. So they searched him, and then they took everybody. And so my parent came down to get us, and my father gave us a speech. So I don't know whatever happened to that. I just know that I didn't do it. So when you ask about, I think there was one other incident where went to a party, and then somebody, that same person, said something to a house, some folks on the house who were white, and then they started chasing him all the way to another place. So other than that, I couldn't say that there was any real hostility. where people were really like pissed every day. Well, I don't use the word pissed, but open, blatant. So that would have been 66, 67.
Going into 67, in July, how did you first hear about what was going on 12th Street?
I can tell you where I was at. I was at the Fox Theater. I got up, there was a Sunday. I got up, we had made plans to go see Robin Seymour, if you recall, they used to have the Motown Reviews.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that used to be in the winter when they were supported by the Motown Reviews. We'd go there and we'd be seeing David Ruffin and all these guys who I grew up around, didn't know them because they all lived between not far from Motown. You see them with all they looking fancy hair, fancy clothes, or practicing or whatever. Everybody else going to work, they out there practicing. So all these Motown guys, you see them on the duplex. We would go to these Motown reviews, and I would because it was my first time, because Motown reviews were prominent in the wintertime, and they had started 62, 63, 64. Well, I was not old enough at that time to go. So, but when I got back, 66, 67, those time frames, I was old enough to go on my own, and you could take the bus anywhere in the city, wherever you wanted to go. So I was always taking the West Side bus, which bus stop would have been over here, and you could just go anywhere. And I can remember being at that bus stop, and you'd hear the record shop playing Aretha Franklin's music, and you'd be saying, "Man." But the East Side folks always looked a little different. That's always sort of one of the things, that it was more East Side, West Side. So 67, we get up. My friend Willie, Emery. Yeah, it was three of us. Me, Willie, and Emery. Willie's still alive. Emery's passed on. We get up. We're going to down to the Fox Theater, and we're going to the Motown, basically a Motown review, but it's been booked as Robin Seymour's Summertime Review. So we get down there and we're having a ball, because now we see all of the Motowners and whoever was on the bill, and it's a quiet Sunday, because on Sunday mornings here in Detroit, people you either were coming in or you were going to church. It was quiet, clean, the buses going everywhere. So we took the bus, and we go past Lewis the Hatter, all these stores, Sibley shoes, and you say, "Man, I'm gonna get me them shoes, man. I'm gonna get me this suit." You go inside and you got all these pictures of these stars on the thing, and you say, "Man, I'm gonna get that like Eddie Kendricks got," So now we down here, and so and everybody just like when you have whatever type of music venue you're at, everybody's got their persona on. So it happens to be down in this, everybody's always trying to be cool, just like being a star. So you have to be careful. You don't want to bump into anybody and start a little fracas. So they started the show, and Martha and the Vandellas and Smokey were the headliners. So the next thing you know, they stopped the show, and Martha and Smokey come out, and they announced that there's some disturbance in the city, and some of the bus lines are going to be having a problem. So the bus line I'm thinking about is the Grand River bus line, and when they mentioned Warren, well, guess what? The Grand River crosses Warren to go to the West Side. And we saying, what the heck? So after they make that announcement, well, I'm a knucklehead. I'm 16, 17. I want to see the show. I don't know what's going on out there because I paid my money to see the show. I done cut grass. I done all this other stuff. And so the show goes on, and Martha, because this is significant to the music thing. On that show was a group called the Parliaments. You know who the Parliaments are? Mm-hmm. Okay, this is George Clinton and the Parliaments. At that time, they were dressed to mirror the Temptations. They didn't look anything like what he looks like now, because also he lived in my neighborhood. Well, one of them, the little small one named Fuzzy. So everywhere in the city of Detroit, it was not unusual for you to be living next to somebody who might have been a popular musician or whatever. So in '67, at that show, George Clinton was there and with his group called the Parliaments, and they were mirroring the Temptations, and the song that they sang was Old Man River. And they did an outstanding job because George Clinton was also a writer for Motown. He sung the song. So I'm leaving that as a pinpoint for him and his career. So now the show is over with, and we're going outside. We had called. We come out from the show. We found that, man, it looked like a war zone out here, and. So now we're trying to figure out what to do. We're 13, 14, 15, 16 years old. We're not driving. The bus is our thing. So now we got to get to a phone. You didn't have any of these. You had to get some quarters and call home. So Willie called his stepfather, and he came and got us. And he must have come down Davidson to Jeffries, to the Chrysler and back to pick us up. And that way we went back the same way, and as we went back, we saw the smoke and the fire. And he also had his pistol on the front seat, just in case there was some issues that he might have ran into. Once we got home, then my father, again, made me paint the house. We had a white house, 2 stories, that's what I did. My brother was in Washington, D.C. He's a little more rambunctious. He wanted to come back and participate. The little group we hung out with was about 10 people, and about 6 of them had, they could have a lot more flexibility than me and my brothers had. So they ended up going out and being involved with things, and they ended up either getting picked up, and I don't know how long they might have spent, but they might have spent a couple of days in jail. But and because they come back with all these stories or whatever, and we went down this road and they were burning this, or they were with groups of people who were part of the insane activities. So we sat around and we were listening to them, and I was sort of glad that I didn't get involved, because most of those guys, they ended up not really doing well later on in life. So, but as we went up, all of those houses, all of those businesses along Grand River, Wyoming area, all those businesses that got burnt out, many of those areas did not get rebuilt. Even pastors, cleaners, because many of the businesses were owned by maybe folks from the Jewish community, and they employed black people. I remember pastors, cleaners that was there on Fullerton and Myers. It was owned by a Jewish family, but the person who worked the front, and Mr. Friendly, the person who took in all of the workload, was a black person. That's why he made his living. So many of the people who may not have owned the business, but they earned a living from that, they lost their jobs, because no longer is that place sitting there anymore. Mm-hmm. So, but a lot of people didn't think about that. The further down you go down Grand River, the more destruction you could see because again, my uncle's shop. I think he might have got. He might. I know he put Soul Brother up on this thing. Now my uncle G.W. Raspberry. At the time, he's also was the first black person to put in at the SS Kresge store down on Woodward. He was able to start selling wigs out of there. So he was doing pretty well in the beauty care arena. So quite sure he didn't want his business being burnt out. So he suffered, but it was a lot of destruction all over, and many, you could see when I was able to get out, you could see some of the smoldering in some of the places that just yesterday you might have been able to go in there and buy something. So, it was a trying time. I didn't see I think the riot was more of an economic deal because of frustration, because there was no time that I ever see or heard where somebody like, I'm coming after you because I see you, and say, hey, there's that white dude, let's get him. And I didn't hear or see any of that. What I saw was people talking about getting televisions and that sort of things that they didn't have, getting things that they needed. Now, I'm a little bit of historian on some of this stuff. The 43 riot was different. People were actually going for people and attacking them. But the atmosphere was that people wanted stuff. That's what I saw. That's what I heard. And afterwards, that was what was the talk, that people wanted stuff. So
is that how you interpret you use the term riot? Do you see it as that, or do you see it as a rebellion of sorts?
Here's the thing about, I've grown since that time frame. At the first time, it was definitely unrest. Because see, with me, that was just part of it, because, there was several events that happened afterwards I saw 67 as more economic. Mm-hmm. 68, when Martin Luther King was killed and Bobby Kennedy and those were, and then with the Black Panthers and all of the race stuff, those to me were more race riots, where somebody was saying, I'm going to get that guy. In 67, I don't recall anybody saying, I'm going to get that person. I felt they were saying, I'm going to get me a TV. I'm going to get me this. I'm going to get me that. Even though I guess there was riots in 65 in L.A. that might have been the baseline, but I didn't feel that the 67 riot was one where people were after a particular group. I think they were frustrated because, it started because there was two Vietnam vets who had returned, and they were having a party. Well, see, today, you get recognition. I spent 20 years in the service, and I got another 16 years as a civil servant. Now, they make darn sure that people come back from Iraq and all these places, that they have ceremonies and they are recognized. And during that time frame, Vietnam, that was not the case. People come home, they come in, and they want to drain down, they want the pressure, the stress, and so they were having a party, because at that time you had what you had called blue laws. You couldn't buy liquor and all that stuff on Sunday morning, and so they were at a particular place and partying, and they got busted. Now the cops, I can tell you, I've always been tall. But these cops at that time frame, they were tall and big, and they were shiny because many of them wore leather, and they be riding horses and stuff. So they looked pretty intimidating. So the police at that time were pretty intimidating. So how that clash came about, of these guys trying to come back from a stressful situation without ceremony. And then now they have ceremony. Now it all breaks out into a riot there on 12th and Clermont. Yeah, it was on Clermont. So that's part of that challenge there. I didn't see it as I'm gonna go get me some guy. I didn't see it as that. I saw it was out because people in school was like, man, I got my television, I got I got this and I got that. They didn't say I got somebody's head, mounted up. I don't recall that. It's just that I didn't see it that way. It was bad, it was rough, but when I reflect back on it, I don't see where something like in '60. I've seen in later years, I saw where people saying, I'm going over here and I'm going to do this to somebody else. So that's the difference to me. So.
Did your parents ever think about moving out of the city because of it?
No. But they worked too hard to get the house that they got. Mm-hmm. And matter of fact, it's a shame. That's part of the challenge now. My parents' house, even though the neighborhood was falling down, their house was still immaculately taken care of. And so many of those neighborhoods were intact. They grew and they built those neighborhoods and the folks working, and part of the challenge is that many people, most people from black cultures do poorly with inheritance because they're not. Many people from white cultures understand inheritance. They understand that I'm supposed to go from here to there and carry the family names. Well, it's a little different in black cultures because sometimes everybody's going in a different direction, and sometimes they're not blood relatives, and you got a lot of infighting. So inheritance, that particular point in time was a time when people of color owned property at probably the greater time after the Civil War. And what happened is you couldn't transfer that property down to the next person because they didn't know how to handle it. Because they're not used to transferring property. When I say the principle of property, like understanding wills, mm-hmm. that sort of thing. This is my mama's house, but then if you don't pay the taxes on it, or if you don't cut the grass on it, if you don't keep it the way your mama did, then there's a problem. And so then the person becomes apathetic, because, well, the hell with this. So that's what I'm saying about that from an economic standpoint. Mm-hmm. If you look at many of these folks with European descent, these properties carry over generation after generation after generation because it's instilled in them. So I'm getting off the topic a little bit, but those neighborhoods that was the opportunity because those neighborhoods were built for success. Because once you were able to, because now the banks were starting to lend money. It wasn't land contracts. There were actual contracts with a realtor and a bank and a mortgage company, legitimate. But most people, my mother never shared. She took care of all the business in our house. So my father was not part of that. He uneducated. He didn't know about it. He depended on my mother, and my mother took care of that stuff. So those are some of the contributing factors that he did the work on the house, but my mother knew the paperwork on the house, how to maintain it. All those neighborhoods were like that. People they got these homes and they cherishing these places because they work. All these factories are working, and then but then the part of the problem came in passing it on because the next group of people may have not really understood what the role should have been. So,
are you optimistic for the city moving forward?
Yeah, I am. I think it's pretty nice that we got a lot of this stuff that's being rebuilt. When I go, I see a lot of change. I see a lot of. I'm an optimistic person. when I left the city for a number of years and I come back to visit my parents, I would speak with my wife and say, should go on, should be what's happening in the 90s, and it wasn't happening. It's only been happening recently. And I think it's good. I think, because we would go to other places and I think part of the challenge of change is because we are a union town, and it's hard to change when you're union. You know, it's too many people involved. You know, entrepreneurs have to come in, they have ideas, and you get that idea implemented, and you have less barriers to that. So I'm glad that these families, the Illich family and Gilbert, are leading the way. So I think there's a better. I think better days are coming, as the saying goes with Father Gabriel. So.
All right. Thank you so much for sitting down with me today. I greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, I didn't mean to talk your ear off, but let me tell you about George Clinton. You see, he was at that show. His group were dressed like Temptation after the riot. See, because this is my metaphor or my picture. When I saw him the next time, he was dressed and acted in the chaotic fashion that he acts now. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of how that gives an illustration of, on that day, July 23rd, 1967, when I woke up that morning, George Clinton was a temptation, per se. When I went to bed that night in that chaos, when I saw him again, him and his group were like they were now, like was spaced out. You know, so with that, I'm done talking.